One of the things I find most fascinating about the Nile River is how it often is spoken of as one river, but the location and law surrounding each section of it makes it seem at times to be completely different rivers. There is the bounteous, silt-laden Egyptian Nile, which spreads its palm out at the Mediterranean delta. And then there is Abay, the Blue Nile, all 900 miles or 1,450 kilometers of it, rumbling only one name, Ethiopia, as it rushes down the mountains from Lake Tana. Then there is the White Nile of the Sudans, a gift from Uganda's Nnalubaale or Lake Victoria. In last week's episode of the Mythological Africans podcast, we sailed down the Blue Nile through Ethiopia. Having arrived back at its confluence with the White Nile just south of Khartoum in Sudan, we continue our journey through South Sudan into Uganda. We start with river lore from the Shilluk of South Sudan and end with more contemporary folk beliefs about Bujagali Falls in Uganda, where the White Nile spills from Lake Victoria. Hello, friends, and welcome to the Mythological Africans podcast, where we read and talk about stories from African mythology and folklore. I am your host, Helen Tunde. The Nile's influence on the evolution of Egypt is so predominant in the narrative about it, it can be easy to forget that this same river has fed other civilizations and communities along its path. The Shilluk, the Dinka, and the Nuer communities of South Sudan all have, historically, flourished because of their access to the Nile. It is said that at one point, the Shilluk so densely populated the 200-mile stretch of the Nile's bank, that is their homeland. Many who visited the area remarked that it seemed to be the most densely settled part of Africa outside of Egypt itself. The Shilluk also call themselves the Kolo. Their foundational legend is possibly one of the better known pieces of Nile folklore from South Sudan. The story starts with Diangadok, a grey cow which emerges from the Nile carrying a gourd. The gourd breaks, and from it emerged animals and a man who is given the name Kolo. As these stories go, Kolo fathers a son, Omaro, and Omaro in turn fathers a son, Mol. Mol also fathers a son, Okwa, and it's Okwa's story that is known among the people because he meets and marries Nyakayo, a crocodile goddess of the Nile, who is also called the mother of the river. And together they father Nyikang, the god king of the Shilluk people. And the organizational hierarchies of the Shilluk people is directly descended from their understanding of who Nyikang is. Traditionally, Nyakayo is an important goddess to the Shilluk women. She is the embodiment of the river in all its manifestations. And crocodiles, which are her animal, are sacred to Shilluk women. And so they don't eat the flesh. I dedicate a whole section of my book on African folklore, the Watkins Book of African Folklore, to the Shilluk Foundation legend. So you should definitely buy it and read more. And I'll include a link to different purchase options in the episode notes. The Dinka people call themselves the Dieng, which means people. The Sobat River, which is one of the major tributaries of the White Nile, holds a special place in Dieng folklore. As the story goes, an old childless woman once lived on the river's bank. She ate fish from the river and largely kept to herself. That is, until one day, a man from the river splashed water on her and she became pregnant. She carried the child for 8 years before bearing a son, who she named Ewel Longar. And if you don't know, Ewel Longar is a legendary hero of the Dieng and the founding father of 6 clans amongst the people. The Nuer people call themselves the Nath, which also means people. I'm noticing a trend here. They are said to be a branch of the Dieng or the Dinka, and their homeland sits on the marshlands where the Sobat River and the Bahr el Ghazal, which are two main tributaries of the White Nile, meet the White Nile itself. And I wasn't able to find any Nile specific lore from the Nuer, so let's plan to visit this at a later time. But it's worth keeping in mind that the network of rivers that spread into the land and feed back into the White Nile really strongly influence the folklore and the beliefs of the people in this whole region. All that being said, I have to say I find this theme of people finding spouses or having children with river beings utterly fascinating. And it's a common enough theme in African folklore. Depending on where you are, this might be a good or a bad thing. It does make me wonder though if the reality underlying it all is that rivers, being a major means of transport back in the day, were a common enough place for people to meet others coming from places which would be beyond their concept of the known world, and so it would seem like they emerged from the river. It reminds me of yet another theme that's common in African folklore, and this is the one of people coming down from the sky or from trees. And to some scholars of folklore, this alludes to the fact that people who come into the land from places beyond what the people of that land know are seen to have fallen from the sky, as they would say. As it turns out, I also explore this theme of people coming down from the sky in my book, so again, you should definitely buy it. We sail on up the river, leaving behind Shilluk, Dinka, and Nuer territory. Eventually, the banks change from rock and sand of desert land to dense undergrowth and floating vegetation. More and more animals dot the riverbank. Here, herds of cattle, and there, wild animals cautiously sipping as they watch us pass. The air becomes alive with the flutter of wings and bird song. Bee-eaters, cranes, storks, herons, cormorants, vultures, green parakeets, flocks and flocks of birds. We sail past floating islands of papyrus and elephant grass and other plants. We pass crocodiles still as logs of wood on the riverbanks and hippopotami who open their maws wide. Warning or boredom? We don't stop to ask. We sail on across the border into Uganda, where the Nile slips off its Sudanese identity and becomes Uganda. The contemporary names of the different sections of the Ugandan Nile reflect the explorations of John Hannings Peake and Richard Burton, and these were two British military officers best known for being the first Westerners to trace the White Nile to its source in Lake Victoria or Nnalubaale. The river becomes the Albert Nile when we cross from South Sudan into Uganda, and the name is given to honor Prince Albert, who was Queen Victoria's husband. As we travel further upstream, it becomes the Victoria Nile until it reaches Lake Victoria, which honored the Queen herself. But European names don't necessarily change the relationships that indigenous people have with the landforms of their homeland. To many Ugandans, Lake Victoria is Nnalubaale, which in Luganda means mother of guardian spirits. And this recalls the ancestral spirits believed to guard the lake. The spirit of Bujagali Falls is one of such spirits. It's at Bujagali Falls that Lake Victoria tips over some of its bounty to start the flow that becomes the White Nile. So as you can imagine, this stretch of river is very important to the people who live in the area, and they're mainly the Busoga people. The fall is said to house some of the most important ancestral and family spirits of the Busoga, including the spirit of Prince Nambamba Bujagali, who is just one of the most venerated spirits for the people. And before the construction of the Bujagali Dam, which harnesses the river's power for Ugandan use, a report compiled to understand the ecological and cultural impact of that dam noted that there were 16 islands, 32 shrines, 10 trees, 6 rocks, 20 burial grounds, 2 fireplaces, and a forest of spiritual importance to the Busoga people who live in the area. So, of course, rituals of appeasement and relocation had to be performed before the dam could be constructed. And this story is reminiscent of the construction of the Aswan Dam, which harnessed the Nile for Egyptian use further downstream, but also destroyed several historically and culturally significant Nubian settlements and necessitated that a large hundreds of thousands of Nubian people be resettled for the Aswan Dam to exist. Now, there are quite a few stories about how dam construction on the African continent has been haunted by the spirits of the rivers the projects commandeer, but perhaps we will leave that for another episode. Meanwhile, this concludes our meandering journey up the Nile. I hope you have enjoyed learning about the peoples and the cultures this great river has supported as much as I have. As always, you'll find references and links to further reading in the episode notes. And if you can't get enough of African folklore, once again, consider buying my book, The Watkins Book of African Folklore, and there are links to purchasing options in the episode notes. Thank you for listening, and we'll be back next week.